Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of ISO 45001-2018. This morning we'll be covering an overview of the changes between the ISO 45001 standard and its predecessor OSAS 18001, and we'll also cover some transition information today. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I have a brief agenda on this slide to give you an idea of what we'll cover today. As I said, we're focusing on an overview of the changes between the two standards, but we'll open up by talking a little bit about PJR, some of the benefits of a certification such as ISO 45001. We'll cover migration information for clients who haven't transitioned between the two standards yet. We will cover the key changes between the two standards and then go into a little bit more detail with looking at some of the clauses that have been more substantially revised. We will talk about a couple other changes that coincide with the release of ISO 45001, and we'll close with an overview of the certification process for clients pursuing certification for the first time. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can type them into the questions field in the GoToWebinar toolbar, but I will save those for the end. PJR is one of the leading registrars in the world. This is not an all-inclusive list of countries in which we have certified clients, but it certainly gives you an idea of our global presence as a certification body. Perry Johnson Registrars is accredited to grant certification for a wide variety of standards. Obviously, today we're talking about ISO 45001. However, we do offer, as I said, a wide variety of other standard certifications. We are in the process of pursuing accreditation. We already have achieved accreditation through UCAS, and we're pursuing ANAB accreditation as well. Benefits and drivers for ISO 45001 certification obviously vary by organization, but in general, there are improvements to the organization's occupational health and safety performance through implementing and maintaining a ISO 45001 management system, as well as providing a safe environment in which to do business. The standard and the management system assists in minimizing the risk of production delays, drives improvements and increases in management commitment and employee engagement, assists the organization in meeting legal requirements. There are strategic business management benefits, such as meeting stakeholder requirements, improving public image, and providing a competitive advantage. The ability to integrate this management system with other business management systems is also a driver for certification for some organizations. The management system maintenance can also drive improvements to supplier health and safety performance. In some cases, it can also provide a financial benefit. As I said, it can provide a competitive advantage if you are bidding for work or advertising your certifications. That can provide a competitive advantage, which can yield financial benefits. In some areas and some industries, there's also potential cost savings for insurance by maintaining the ISO 45001 certification or some type of health and safety management system certification. As I mentioned earlier, ISO 45001 replaces OSAS 18001. So OSAS 18001 was not an ISO standard. So technically the correct verbiage is a migration because you're switching from one standard to a different standard rather than transitioning between two revisions of the same standard. So I'm going to do my best to use the term migrate instead of transition. That's typically the term we use, so it's a common mistake to make to mix those up. But ISO 45001 replaces OSAS 18001. The standard defines the requirements for establishing, implementing, and maintaining an occupational health and safety management system, commonly abbreviated OHSMS. It represents a framework for allowing an organization to control its hazards, reduce the risk of accidents, injuries, ill health, and/or downtime, and to continually improve its processes and operations. ISO 45001 was published in March of 2018, and it is a voluntary certification, meaning it is not a regulatory requirement to maintain this certification. Other standards may require this certification to maintain certification to another standard, or some clients, customers, suppliers may require this, but since it's not a regulatory requirement, this would be a voluntary certification. For anyone migrating from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, you probably already know that there was a 3-year migration period, meaning that from the date of publication of ISO 45001, everyone had 3 years to transition. So we are coming up on that deadline, but it was extended earlier this year to account for the difficulties that the COVID pandemic has caused in clients' abilities to schedule their audits and implement those changes. So the new deadline, the overall deadline to transition is September 11th, 2021. PGR has issued a transition plan that can be found on our website. In order to avoid a lapse in certification, PGR recommends an earlier deadline, and I want to take this opportunity to remind you why. Not only does the migration audit need to occur by that deadline, but the certificate itself needs to be issued, and there are a lot of steps that take place between the audit and the issuance of a certificate. If there are any nonconformities issued during your audit, those need to be resolved through the corrective action process in your organization, as well as approved by your auditor, and then the audit package gets reviewed internally at PJR by a technical reviewer before it gets sent to the certificate department to work on having a draft sent to the client, approved, and finally the final version of the certificate issued. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's why we recommend an earlier deadline. Migration audits can occur during either surveillance or recertification audits. So if you haven't already migrated, expect to do so at your next audit. We are adding at least one audit day for all of the transition requirements. This is a requirement. PGR is required to add a day based on the ISO 45001 transition plan, if I'm remembering correctly where that requirement came from. But there are a lot of changes between OSAS 18001 and ISO 45001. So during that transition audit, making the audit time longer to account for the verification of all of those changes is important. I've put this timeline together for a visual representation of the transition information, or the transition timeline, the migration timeline. So as you can see, we're pretty far into the transition period at this time. Our auditors have been trained. We've revised our audit documentation. We've already conducted a majority of the migration audits. So as I said, we are looking for you to transition or to migrate, during your next audit if you haven't already done so. So if you have another OSAS 18001 certificate audit scheduled, please reach out to your scheduler to make sure that your migration audit has been captured or scheduled as appropriate. Any certificates that have not migrated to ISO 45001 by the overall deadline of September 11th, 2021 will be withdrawn, which means you'll have a lapse in certification if your certificate hasn't been issued by that date, which is why PGR recommends you transition early. Okay, getting into some of the changes, the key changes in ISO 45001 compared to OSAS 18001. One key difference, as I mentioned, is that ISO 45001 is an ISO standard, whereas OSAS 18001 was technically not. So some recent changes to other ISO standards have been to adopt this Annex SL structure, and you see that in ISO 45000 as well, or ISO 45001 as well, excuse me. So this means that they follow the same general structure, um, very similar, if not identical, names for the clauses, and a lot of common terms shared between those standards. It makes them easier to integrate multiple business management standards together. Having common terms, common formats really simplifies that process. So this is reflected in ISO 45001. That's one of the key changes. We see a revised Plan, Do, Check, Act model as well. This graphic is pulled from the standard to give you an idea of some of the slight changes there. Other key changes in ISO 45001, there's an emphasis on leadership. In fact, there's a whole new clause dedicated to the concept of leadership, assigning specific responsibilities for those in leadership roles to promote health and safety management within the organization and to ensure the success of the system. You'll see through the verbiage in ISO 45001 that this emphasis on leadership has to do with accountability and involvement for those that leadership team or those individuals that would be defined as leadership, not necessarily a management representative anymore. There's a call for proactivity throughout ISO 45001 as well. This is one of the key changes. There's expanded expectations for organizations to be able to protect the health and safety of workers and interested parties through hazard identification processes, risk assessments, operational controls, a whole host of things, but to be more proactive in their approach rather than reacting to incidents, accidents, injuries, near misses, but actually taking the time to proactively um, account for and control those potentials. There's also greater focus on risk management, requiring the planning and determination of risk, considering both the positive and negative, which would be called risks and opportunities in the standard, identified issues, and the needs and expectations of interested parties. So we'll talk more about those changes. There's also a focus on achieving intended outcomes, which is a defined term in the standard. We'll talk about that. There's emphasis on objectives, measurement, and change. A shift in emphasis with regard to continual improvement from improving the management system itself to instead improving the health and safety performance of the organization. Communication and awareness changes have been made in ISO 45000 as well, including what is now equal emphasis on the two, on external and internal communications. And awareness has been separated into its own clause. So there's a competency section and an awareness section. And in some cases, the standard is more prescriptive as to those criteria. Overall, however, the standard is supposed to be less prescriptive, including the incorporation of the term documented information, which is a common term between the other Annex SL structure standards. You may be familiar with this already, but in case you're not, the concept is accounting for both documents and records with this documented information term, kind of an umbrella term, to reflect the use of modern media and various recording options that an organization might choose from, including cloud-based systems, for the organization to be able to determine when a documented procedure is actually required for effective process control. So that's more flexible with the use of that term. There's an increased prominence of occupational health and safety management within the organization's strategic planning process. And ISO 45001 introduces the concept of management of change. So those are the key terms. Like I said, we'll look at those in more detail as time allows. I do want to point out some changes to terms. We're not going to go through the terms themselves. I pulled out some of the changes and they're in the slides. A copy of the slides for today's webinar will be available on PJR's website, as well as a recording of today's webinar. And these, again, are pulled right from the standard. So if you haven't already obtained a copy of the standard, I would encourage you to do so. You can review these terms and definitions on your own time. I do want to draw attention, however, to the definition for intended outcomes, which is found within the Occupational Health and Safety Management System definition. So the intended outcomes of the Occupational Health and Safety Management System are to prevent injury and ill health to workers and to provide safe and healthy workplaces. You see a lot of references throughout ISO 45001 and today's slides to this intended outcomes. Essentially, we are looking to see whether the management system is effective by whether or not it's achieving its intended outcomes. So again, we're looking less at continual improvement of the system, more focused on the improvement of the system's occupational health and safety performance or the organization's performance. And these intended outcomes are a big part of that. So whether or not the management system is effective has a lot to do with whether or not the intended outcomes are being achieved. So I'm going to skip through the rest of these terms. You can review them on your own time. And we'll go through clause by clause some of the key changes. I'm obviously not going to go through every clause. This is just a high-level overview of some of the key changes, and you can review the exact verbiage in the standard on your own time. In clause 4.1, the organization is required to determine both internal and external issues that are relevant to the management system and relevant to its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So these issues that the organization needs to determine relate to the intended outcomes. If they don't have the ability to affect the management system or the intended outcomes, then they would not be relevant for the context of the organization and the scope of this requirement in the standard. After determining those issues that are relevant, then the organization is required to determine relevant interested parties, not just workers, and what their needs and expectations might be. In many cases, those expectations and needs translate to requirements of the management system. Once you've determined both of those, then you would be considering both those issues and those needs and expectations to determine the management system scope. Clause 5 focuses on leadership and worker participation. As I said, this is a new clause to give greater emphasis to leadership accountability. Top management, which is a defined term in the standard as well, needs to take on responsibility for the effectiveness of the management system, as well as other key requirements within the standard. But again, ultimately, top management is going to be held responsible and needs to be accountable for the implementation, the maintenance, and the effectiveness of the management system. The policy and objectives should be aligned with the organization's strategic strategic direction, and achieve the system's intended outcomes. So again, this is one of those ways that we are going to be, as auditors, measuring the effectiveness of the system. One change to the policy requirements is the need to include a commitment to participation. This was not previously in that bulleted list of items to be included in the policy. And as you can see, when I underline these terms in the standard, they are in the slides, they are defined terms within the standard that you can check out the definitions for. I mentioned that a management representative is not necessarily required. It's actually no longer listed in the standard at all. Top management needs to ensure adequate responsibilities and authorities are delegated and assigned. So while top management can delegate their responsibilities, they're ultimately still held accountable for the management system and its effectiveness. And you'll see this reflected in our audits as well. Participation and consultation, both defined terms, have been made more specific in their criteria in the standard, and that can be found in clause 5.4. Not too many changes here. The concept of risks and opportunities I already introduced earlier. We're still determining those risks and opportunities, the items that can cause undesired effects such as injuries and ill health. The idea being achieving its intended outcomes as a management system, determining what those risks and opportunities might be in order to prevent or minimize the undesired associated effects, and to continually improve the management system and the performance of the organization. Risks and opportunities might be related to occupational health and safety hazards, legal and other requirements the organization is subject to, and in turn, risks and opportunities can affect the achievement of intended outcomes. Hazard identification is more prescriptive and again has that tone of proactivity or a call for proactivity to take a broader approach, to be more accountable for things that as an organization you can affect, not just what happens within the 4 or however many walls of your building, but again, to be more proactive in this consideration of hazards. Here are some other things to consider: people in the nearby area who can be affected by the organization, people who might be at the workplace but are not controlled by the organization, work area, equipment designs, actual or proposed changes, past incidents. These are a couple examples to kind of get the ball rolling or get you thinking outside the box that might not previously have been included in the hazard identification process. The organization needs a process to assess risk and also to assess opportunities. As I mentioned, that's positive and negative. And documented information, which is this broader term we're using now, needs to be retained as evidence of having completed this requirement. So it's not specifying what you need to have or whether you need to have a procedure necessarily, but you do need to have a process with proactive criteria established, and you need to have documented information retained. So maybe this would be the outputs you have evidence of. That would be up to the organization to decide. 6.1.3 covers legal and other requirements. ISO 45001 requires up-to-date determination of and access to any applicable requirements for the organization. It's not enough to just have a list of what those requirements are, however. You also have to determine how the requirements apply to the organization and to the organization's hazards and risks. This was actually always a requirement. This was in OSAS 18001 as well. However, the verbiage in ISO 45001 is stronger because this was not effectively implemented across all industries. It is required not only to have a list or some type of determination of what requirements are applicable to your organization, but how do they apply? Because that translates to a variety of requirements, reporting, communication, operational controls, training. And if you haven't done that step, you're not going to be effectively managing or meeting those requirements. Not too many changes regarding action that needs to be taken. The hierarchy of controls is still required and is unchanged. Objectives need to be consistent with the policy, take into account legal and other requirements, risks and opportunities, and the results of participation and consultation. They need to be monitored, measured if possible, they need to be communicated, and you need to keep them up to date as relevant. Specifically regarding the organization's plan to achieve those objectives, the organization needs to determine all of these items, these bulleted items. Not only do they need to determine them, they need to maintain documented information of having determined them. So this needs to be something that an interested party or an auditor can see the outputs of. We need to be able to see what resource needs you've identified for your objectives, what tasks will be implemented to achieve the objective, what's the timeline, who's responsible, how will they be monitored. This needs to be represented in some form or fashion through documented information. As I mentioned, competency and awareness have been separated into two sections. 7.2 requires the organization determine competency requirements for workers that can affect the performance of the management system. Competence must be evidenced through documented information. And if action needs to be taken to close the gap between a specific employee, and the competency requirements for their role, not only do you need to take those actions, you also need to evaluate the effectiveness of those actions. And we'll be looking for evidence of that as well. Sometimes when you're hiring someone, you're doing their onboarding or perhaps promoting from within, switching departments, you've got some competency gaps that you need to close. 7.3 specifies items for workers to be made aware of by the organization. So you'll want to check out that section and ensure your training or your communication process incorporates all of those requirements. No significant changes to internal communication. However, external communication is a little bit more specific. You need to determine the relevant internal, external information and communication requirements that are relevant to the management system. And you need to be specific. What are those communication requirements? Who needs to be communicated with? When? Is there a certain time frame or deadline to communicate certain things, or a certain frequency that they're looking for? Is there a preferred method for communication? Again, to identify all of those relevant requirements. I already introduced the concept of documented information, but more detail can be found in 7.5. There are still requirements for creating, updating, and controlling documented information, just like there was in OSAS 18001 regarding documents and records, respectively. Regarding operational controls, not a lot of changes to this first part of the clause. Planned actions need established criteria. And we see documented information here used to give the organization greater flexibility with what specifically they maintain or how they maintain that documented information, what they deem sufficient to ensure that the process criterias are met. So again, we have a greater level of flexibility for the organization to decide how they maintain those requirements. There are no changes to the hierarchy of controls that are significant, as I mentioned. 8.1.3 is new. However, I mentioned one of the key changes in ISO 45001 is this concept of management of change. Specifically, this requires the organization implement a process for controlling planned changes that could affect the occupational health and safety performance of the organization, as well as review and mitigate any negative impacts of inadvertent changes. Examples include new products, services, or processes, changed working conditions, changes to equipment, changes to legal and other requirements, etc. There is subsections here in 8.1 regarding procurement, contractors. Again, this is a more proactive approach, thinking outside the four walls of your organization to control the hazards that you can control. It specifies that there need to be criteria for contractor selection as well. There are requirements for controlling outsourcing, again, to ensure the intended outcomes of the management system are met. Oops, sorry. No significant changes to the emergency requirements. However, there are some additional items to be considered or included in an emergency response process. So I've listed them out here and they can be found in 8.2. Monitoring and measuring is relatively unchanged. However, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to determine the specifics of the requirements. So just like objectives and targets or communication, how will those be monitored and measured? determining those details, and then we'll be looking for objective evidence through documented information that those have been determined. Internal audit requirements are not significantly changed. There is a requirement in 9.2.2 to share or report the results of internal audits to relevant managers, workers and/or their representatives, and other relevant interested parties. There are a couple slight changes within the management review clause, some additional items or revisions to the inputs and outputs required for those management reviews, and this is to be performed by top management or to have top management participate in these management reviews. Again, holding top management accountable, getting them involved. We need to see the management system outputs reflect that top management accountability, that leadership role that we talked about earlier. Regarding improvement, clause 10.1 requires the identification of opportunities for improvement. This is a concept that has been removed in some other ISO standards, but is alive and well in ISO 45001. 10.2 focuses on incidents, nonconformities, and corrective actions. ISO 45001 requires timely action to address or correct any incidents and nonconformities. Corrective actions need to be reviewed for effectiveness and have evidence of documented information, have evidence in the form of documented information. And 10.2 also requires the results be reported to relevant workers and/or representatives and other interested parties that might be relevant, just like with the internal audit. So again, there's an emphasis, greater emphasis on external communication or the equal importance of internal and external communication for effective maintenance of the management system. So this might be the results referring to an incident investigation or investigation into a nonconformity and associated corrective actions that are determined necessary. Any and all of those could be relevant here. There are some prompts to include a couple different concepts of the management system when we are thinking along the lines of continual improvement. So obviously the occupational health and safety performance would be something to be continually improving. Also, creating and maintaining a culture that supports the management system is important. Participation of workers is important. Communication is important, as well as having evidence of actions and improvements through documented information so that everyone can see what is being done and what's being improved, whether it's employees or interested parties or your auditor. We're going to want to see the outputs of this continual improvement requirement. ISO 45001 has a annex at the end for helping clients utilize the document or implement the requirements of the standard. There's also a bibliography at the end. We won't be going through either of those today. As I mentioned, there are a couple other changes that coincide with the publication of ISO 45001. There are two IAF mandatory documents. I've listed them here. These documents are typically just related to certification body requirements. However, some of the contents trickle down to our clients through our contracts or the way we audit. Our auditing approach changes perhaps we make to the audit requirements or the audit documentation. So I wanted to bring your attention to a couple of those changes that trickle down, as I mentioned. So one of the requirements in these two documents relates to significant change notifications. The requirement in the IAF mandatory document is that if there is a significant change within an organization, and this is a defined term, I'm not sure if it's defined in ISO 45001 or in one of the other ISO documents, but significant change is a specific term, relates to certain types of changes that the organization notify the registrar or the certification body, PJR in this case, as soon as possible and formally in writing. So an email, something like that that we can track. This notification is supposed to happen right away, like within just 2, 3 days, 5 days max. Um, a lot of the significant changes affect risk level, audit time, some of the requirements that we as a registrar are held to for um, maintaining that information for our clients, calculating audit time, confirming risk level, making sure everything is appropriate before the audit goes and is actually taking place. It has to do with the way we schedule the audits, the way we assign auditors, book travel, all of that kind of stuff. And even just logistically, this should not be waiting until the auditor gets on site to do your audit for you to kind of be bringing them up to speed. Some smaller changes, it's fine to approach it that way, but if it constitutes a significant change, then we're potentially looking at changes to audit time that we can't accommodate without incurring, travel penalty fees for those changes, or maybe your auditor is booked on another audit or something back to back with yours and we can't accommodate any additional audit time. There's a lot of reasons why this requirement was formally included in the IAF mandatory documents, but I wanted to give you some background on why we're asking for this information in advance and how detrimental um, only getting this information once your audit has begun can really be. There is a prescribed audit table in these IEF mandatory documents as well for how risk level and employee count are used to calculate audit time. So I wanted to make you aware of that as well, since it's not just something that PGR makes up their own calculations and decides how long your audits will be. I tried to emphasize throughout the presentation the importance of top management and leadership in ISO 45001. Specifically, these IEF mandatory documents take that even a little bit further. So again, top management or leadership needs to be involved, they need to be accountable, they need to be responsible and actively participating in the management system. Arguably one of the most important or the most important part of our audits, the PJR, third party audits that you have done to maintain your certification, would be the closing meeting, where you're going through the entirety of the audit, how everything went, the strengths and weaknesses of the management system, maybe areas for improvement or highlighting things that you guys are doing really well as an organization, and also the explanation of any nonconformities that were identified during the audit that the organization will need to work to resolve and close out. So the closing meeting is a very important part of the audit, and these IEF mandatory documents are specifying that if top management does not attend the closing meeting or have a reasonable excuse for their absence, which we are now required to document, this could lead to a finding against the top management, uh, the leadership clauses, or issues with your certification. We really need to see evidence that top man top management or leadership is meeting those requirements of the standard. So the audit is not usually something that is scheduled only a week out. You have a lot of notice about these audits. You know roughly when they're due every year. The expectation here is that top management is making this a priority. If they travel, if they are taking vacation time, if they float between sites, that they are making it a point to be involved in the audit process and specifically the closing meeting. If they can't be there, maybe they can call in for the closing meeting. But again, this is just trying to raise um, the bar and emphasize the importance of top management and leadership accountability. There's a requirement in here that personnel responsible for monitoring employee health are to be available for interviews during the audit. Again, raising the bar, being more proactive, ensuring that we're having thorough audits. If you, as an organization, are using doctors or nurses, this is well within the scope of the audit. It's not been done very much before, but again, ISO 45001 is raising the bar, and so are these IAF mandatory documents. So if you haven't already been asked to include this in your audit, or the idea of interviewing such individuals been brought up, you can expect that to come up in the near future. Certification bodies reserve the right to conduct special audits in response to compliance issues, incidents, etc., and may even suspend or withdraw certification accordingly. This is found in the terms and conditions. This is a requirement of these IAF mandatory documents that we leave that option available to be implemented as needed. It also spells out the fact that certain types of compliance violations or significant compliance gaps could potentially prevent a company from being certified if they're pursuing certification for the first time. And we would be looking closely at objective evidence to ensure proper handling of those violations before we would make a certification decision. Overall, you can see ISO 45001 and these IAF mandatory documents really raise the bar for the expectations of the occupational health and safety management systems, as well as the occupational health and safety performance of the organization. Okay, before we get to questions, just a brief overview of the certification process for anyone who is not migrating from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, but instead is pursuing certification to ISO 45001 as a new registration. The first step, if you haven't already done so, would be to obtain a copy of the standard. You'll need to establish documented information as required by the standard and as you deem appropriate as an organization. Conduct any training that's necessary to meet the management system requirements, implement the requirements of the occupational health and safety management system and the standard, including conducting an internal audit, conducting a compliance evaluation against those legal and other requirements, and then having your management review. Make sure that your internal audit takes place before your management review, since the internal audit outputs are an input requirement for the management review. You'll also need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. The registration process consists of 2 audits, a stage 1 audit, a stage 2 audit. I will talk about those more on the next slide. Any nonconformities identified, if any, during the stage 2 audit do need to be resolved before a certificate can be issued. So the stage 1 audit is primarily a review of documented information. We're assessing whether the framework for those standard requirements has been implemented by the organization to confirm that they are in fact ready to move to the stage 2 audit phase. The stage 2 audit is a full system audit covering all of the processes, sampling all of the shifts, really get a full picture of how the management system has implemented the requirements of the standard and whether it is effective. You might have nonconformities identified, as I mentioned, which would need to be resolved through the corrective action process before a certificate could be issued. Once a certificate is issued, it is good for 3 years. So following that stage 2, you've got 2 years worth of surveillance audits. Those can be annual or semi-annual based on your contract. The surveillance audits are partial system audits. Theoretically, they should be a little shorter than your stage 2 audit. They don't need to include sampling of all of the processes and all of the shifts. That 3rd year of the cycle would be your recertification audit, which for all intensive purposes is the same as a stage 2 audit in that it samples all the processes, all the shifts, and would result in the issuance of a new certificate after resolving any nonconformities to be good for another 3 years, starting that same cycle over again. There are opportunities to integrate, as I mentioned, the ISO 45001 standard with other standard management systems. And if the system is fully integrated, we can offer discounts in audit time if you're having two different standards be audited together and they're integrated, meaning they have a lot of overlap in the way the system is implemented. They share internal audits, they share management reviews, competency and training records are handled together, things like that. Then we can offer a discount on audit time. This is something that we would evaluate when you are becoming a PGR client. We would look at the level of integration and see if we can apply that discount. Okay, if you have not already done so, but if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the question field. And while I check that, I'm going to go to the last slide in the presentation, which is the contact information slide. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I can be contacted by calling the main PGR phone number listed here on the slide, as well as by email. If you have technical questions or site-specific questions, it may be best to save those questions for outside the webinar and contact me directly. You can also contact our EHS program manager. Stacy is also accessible through the main PGR line and email. If you are a new client looking for a quote, I've also included the contact information for the sales department here. They can be contacted by via this phone number. And I'd be glad to discuss, as I said, any technical questions that you might have. I can be contacted directly. Let's see if we have any questions. Okay, so far no questions. I'll hang out here for another minute before ending the presentation in case someone's typing. But if you have your migration audit scheduled in the near future, I wish you good luck on your migration process. I hope the webinar content is helpful, kind of highlighting those areas to focus on as you prepare for your migration. And if you think of any questions after today's webinar, obviously you can reach out as well. Looks like we do have one question. Okay, there's a question about measurement. The question is, let me open this up here. What about measurement? Which tool will be used? So unfortunately, I'm not sure I understand your question. The monitoring and measurement section or clause is broad. It really encompasses so many things. It depends on the industry and the organization, what you are monitoring and measuring, whether it's related to objectives or regulatory requirements, interested party requirements. I can't specify a tool. There's so many different things an organization might be monitoring. It would be fair to expect the organization to determine if any tools are needed. We can go back to that clause and see. Right, so monitoring and measurement is in clause 9.1.1, but again, the measurement will vary widely depending on what you are specifically monitoring and measuring. And if there is a tool required, you can list that in your documented information as part of your determination. Sometimes measurement is visual even. There's not always a specific tool. So again, this is going to vary so much I can't answer that. I hope that's helpful. Sorry. Let's see. We have another question about examples of worker participation. So I don't have the entire clauses in these slides. I'm trying to highlight the key changes. I don't have the verbiage of the standard in these slides. It would be too long. We can't get through all of that in an hour. And this isn't a standard specific training. We're just trying to help our clients make the migration process a little bit easier. I'm trying to go back to the portion that would be talking about participation and consultation, and pull that up here. So they are defined terms, and that would be a good place to start to look at the definitions section to see what participation is talking about specifically. I think that that would be a good place for you to start to get some clearer understanding of that requirement. Um, I have here, and I don't think I read this part specifically, but 5.4 in ISO 45001 specifically emphasizes non-manager participation in consultation. So areas that employees might participate in, just a couple examples would be hazard and risk identification, identifying what operational controls might be beneficial in their given areas, the incident investigation process they can participate in, if they were a part of the incident, if they witnessed the incident, things like that. Determining the needs and expectations of interested parties, determining monitoring and measurement needs. The idea being top management is not making all of these decisions unilaterally without taking into account the relevant experience and viewpoint of the people who are doing that job on a day-to-day basis. So someone sitting in an office on the other end of a plant might think, making a particular change is a great idea on paper, but to not take into account the viewpoint or the perspective of the workers in that department is a mistake. That's a significant gap. So those would be some examples of worker participation. Okay, we have another question. This one's regarding management of change. Can management of change apply to existing hazard assessments and the process for keeping that information up to date? Um, Perhaps to an extent, but that's not the intent. The intent of management of change is planning for changes. So let me bring that clause back up again. Again, this is not the verbiage of the clause within the standard, but my notes about those key changes. So management of change focuses on planned changes that could affect the health and safety performance of the organization. So the idea being this call for proactivity, this emphasis on proactivity, that you are not making a change and then dealing with the ramifications of that change, positive or negative after the fact. If you are looking to change types of PPE or introduce a new piece of equipment, add a new product or process, there are so many examples I can think of, but to plan out those changes, to do the hazard assessment or the risk assessment, go through trying to identify what risks that may introduce or how it might affect the organization, to be able to account for those before you make the change. Um, do you need to assess machine guarding needs? Do you need to make physical changes to that section of the organization? Is training required? Is additional PPE required? Will this change affect a legal requirement by, for example, changes in employee count or changes in paint type or chemicals that will affect your reporting or your PPE needs? Again, the idea being that you're not just making that change and then seeing what happens. You are, really proactively planning for those changes, to have those operational controls already implemented or already ready to go, ready to implement in conjunction with that change to avoid injuries, incidents, near misses, um, those kinds of things by having planned in advance. I hope that answers your question. Okay, so that's all the questions we have for today. Again, if you have your migration audit coming up, best of luck. I hope this is helpful. We offer these webinars on various subjects every month. I'm doing the ISO 45001 every couple of months at least, because we do still have clients who haven't migrated yet. but we also have those recordings on PJR's website available for your reference. So thank you for joining me today. Um, I'm just going to go back to the contact information slide in case anyone doesn't feel that their questions were answered. And again, the slides and the recording will be on PGR's website um, within a day or two, I would say. So I hope you have a great day. Thanks for joining us and best of luck during your migration.